So I want to start by taking us back to 1969.
Okay.
There was this Stanford psychologist, right, Philip Zimbardo, and he conducted an experiment that, honestly, it kind of fundamentally changed how we understand human behavior.
Yeah, the car experiment. It's classic.
Exactly. So for anyone who hasn't heard of this, he basically took two identical cars,
Sure.
just standard cars, but he removed their license plates, and he parked them in two completely different locations.
Right.
One of them was left in this notoriously tough, kind of rough neighborhood in the Bronx, and the other one was parked in Palo Alto, California, like right near the Stanford campus.
Yeah.
Very affluent, very quiet.
Two entirely different worlds.
Completely.
Yeah.
And the results for the first part were pretty much exactly what you'd expect. I mean, the car in the Bronx was just stripped for parts within, I think, 24 hours.
Wow.
Yeah. Everything of value was taken, and whatever was left was just smashed. But the car in Palo Alto, it just sat there, entirely untouched for over a week.
Just completely ignored.
Yeah. People walked by it, they ignored it, they just went about their business.
Yeah.
But then Zimbardo did something really fascinating. He actually walked up to this pristine, untouched car in Palo Alto with a sledgehammer.
Okay.
And he smashed just one single window. Just one.
Yeah.
And then he backed away and just watched what happened.
And this is the crazy part.
It's wild. Within a matter of hours, that single broken window, it basically triggered this massive cascade of destruction. The residents of this quiet, affluent neighborhood, they basically descended on the car and completely destroyed it, just like the one in the Bronx.
I mean, it's such a stark image.
It really is. And the takeaway here, the reason we're starting with this, is that it wasn't about crime rates at all. It was that a single visual cue of disorder, just a broken piece of glass, could completely override the internal moral compass and the discipline of an entire neighborhood.
It's the environment literally dictating the behavior.
Yes. And today, we are going to look at the metaphorical broken glass in your life.
I love that framing.
Because we are diving into a really massive stack of sources today. We've got neuroscientific journals on habit formation. We've got behavioral change frameworks from Dr. Judd.
We're also looking at some really fascinating research on decision fatigue from the University of Southern California.
Right. And Ben Mears' comprehensive guide to environment design. And our mission today, the real reason we're doing this deep dive, is to explore a deeply uncomfortable but I think a really liberating question.
Which is?
What if the invisible cues in your environment are biologically destroying your ability to reach your goals? And what if you have been blaming your own lack of motivation this entire time?
Yeah. I mean, it is a radical reframing of how we view our own failures. Really.
It is. Because we do, don't we? We blame ourselves.
Constantly. We spend our entire lives deeply, deeply convinced that if we just had more willpower or, more drive or a stronger character, we could just overcome the friction in our lives.
Right. Like we just aren't trying hard enough.
Exactly. We treat motivation like it's this moral imperative. Like if you aren't motivated, you're a bad person. But when you actually look at the neurobiology of habit formation, alongside all this modern digital productivity research we are parsing today, that entire narrative just completely collapses.
It just falls apart.
Totally. The science tells us that relying on internal motivation to overcome a disordered environment is, well, it's like trying to run a highly demanding software program on a laptop with a dying battery.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right, because it doesn't matter how badly you want the program to run. It doesn't matter how important the work is. The hardware will eventually just shut down.
Okay, I want to challenge that immediately, though, because to a lot of people, that sounds almost entirely deterministic.
Sure.
Like if we were just products of our environment, just reacting to cues like those people smashing that car in Palo Alto. Yeah. Where does personal agency come in?
That's the big question.
Because we all know people who have built this incredible discipline, right? People who wake up at 5 a.m., they hit the gym, they build businesses, and they seem just entirely immune to the chaos around them. So are we just kind of letting ourselves off the hook here by saying, my environment made me do it?
Well, I mean, that is the natural defense mechanism our ego throws up when we hear this kind of thing.
Oh, all right.
We desperately want to believe we are the conscious authors of every single action we take. But this isn't about absolving ourselves of responsibility at all. It is really about reallocating where we apply our agency.
Reallocating it. Okay, say more about that.
Think about that highly disciplined person you were just describing, the one waking up at 5 a.m.
Yeah.
What the research shows is that they are rarely just muscling through incredible resistance every single morning. They aren't waking up and fighting a mental war every day.
They aren't, because it looks like they are.
It looks like it, but they aren't. They have actually used their agency to design a system that makes waking up at 5 a.m. the path of least resistance.
Oh, interesting.
They haven't built a higher tolerance for suffering. They've just engineered a life that requires less suffering to execute. They have removed the broken glass from their immediate surroundings.
So the distinction here is really where the effort is placed. Like the effort goes into the design of the life, not the daily execution of the task.
Precisely. And this distinction becomes incredibly, incredibly clear when we look at the phenomenon that our sources refer to as the motivation roller coaster.
Oh, man.
The roller coaster.
Yeah. The article from Freedom details this cycle perfectly. And honestly, it is a cycle every single person listening to this right now has experienced. Probably dozens of times.
At least.
So here's how it goes. You encounter a spark.
Right.
Maybe you watch an inspiring documentary, or you read a book like Atomic Habits or something, or you listen to a deep dive like this one, and you experience this massive surge of clarity.
You feel invincible.
You really do. You decide right then and there you're going to learn a new language, or you're going to pivot your career entirely. And for the first 72 hours, you are just relentless. You're buying the notebooks, you're downloading the app.
Exactly. You are studying, you are outlining, you are executing flawlessly.
I know that feeling so intimately.
Yeah.
You feel almost physically lighter, like the friction of starting a new task just totally vanishes.
Yes.
But I want us to look at the actual mechanics of that 72-hour window.
Yeah.
Because why does it feel so effortless initially, and why does it inevitably crash? Because the crash, that's the part that breeds all that toxic self-blame we carry around.
It's exactly right.
Like by day 4, that inspiring documentary is just a distant memory. A stressful email comes in from a client, or you sleep poorly one night, and suddenly the idea of opening that language app feels like trying to move a literal boulder.
Yeah, the weight of it becomes crushing. Yeah. And to understand that crash, we really have to look at what motivation actually is on a chemical level.
Okay, let's get into the neurobiology of it.
So motivation is primarily driven by the dopaminergic system in the brain. When you watch that documentary and you set that big new goal, your brain experiences what neuroscientists call a reward prediction error.
A reward prediction error. What does that mean exactly?
It means you are visualizing a future state like being totally fluent in French or being highly successful in this new career, and your brain releases this massive spike of dopamine in anticipation of that future reward.
So you get the chemical reward before you even do the work.
Exactly. And that dopamine spike physically narrows your focus. It provides actual metabolic energy to initiate the action. It is a brilliant evolutionary mechanism designed to get you moving toward a newly discovered resource.
It's the spark to start the fire.
It is. But, and this is the crucial part, a spark is inherently unstable.
Right. You can't heat a house with just a spark.
No, you can't. Dopamine is simply not designed to maintain a steady baseline over months and months of tedious execution. The system habituates.
It gets used to it.
Exactly. By day 4, the novelty of the goal has worn off. The reward prediction error normalizes. And so the dopamine spike just stops.
It's gone.
It's gone. And suddenly, the metabolic free ride is over. Your brain realizes it now has to expend significant real energy to keep executing this new behavior. And we have to remember, the brain's primary evolutionary directive is the conservation of energy.
Wow. So I want to just pause right there for a second, because if you're listening to this right now, when you were sitting on the couch on day 4, staring at your phone, feeling entirely drained, and choosing to watch Netflix instead of studying, that is not a character flaw.
No, not at all.
It is literally your biological system functioning exactly as it was designed to.
Yeah.
Your brain recognizes a high-energy task, realizes the dopamine subsidy is gone, and just pulls the emergency brake to conserve resources.
It's just trying to keep you alive and efficient. The tragedy, though, is how we interpret that biological brake.
Because we take it so personally.
We do, because society has completely commodified motivation. We sell it in these expensive seminars and in, aesthetic Instagram quotes as a permanent state of being.
Like it's a personality trait. Oh, he's just a motivated person.
Exactly. So when the dopamine naturally drops, the individual internalizes it as a profound personal failure. They think they're weak or broken or lazy.
Lazy. That's the word everyone uses against themselves.
Always. But motivation is an emotion, just like anger or joy, and you wouldn't expect yourself to remain in a state of intense, unyielding joy for 3 months straight.
Yeah,
quote.
that would be exhausting.
It's biologically impossible, yet we demand that our motivation remains at this fever pitch indefinitely, and when it doesn't, we hate ourselves.
That is so deeply validating to hear. I mean, if motivation is just a transient chemical state, then setting massive goals based entirely on that state seems fundamentally flawed from the start.
It is a recipe for chronic disappointment.
Which brings us to this concept from StratLab Marketing that's in our source stack today. And they make a very blunt statement that I really want us to dissect.
I know the one you mean.
Yeah, they claim, quote, goals are for losers, systems are for winners.
It's harsh.
It is. And I imagine a lot of high achievers listening to this just kind of bristled at that because we are taught from childhood to set goals. We are taught to make smart goals. We're taught that visionary goals are what drive humanity forward. So how can we impartially say that goals are for losers?
Well, it's deliberately provocative, of course, but the underlying mechanics of that statement are actually very sound. Let's separate the idea of a direction from the idea of a goal.
Okay, what's the difference?
Having a direction, like a general heading of where you want your life to go or your health to go, is absolutely vital. But a strict goal is a finite endpoint. It is a binary state. You either achieved it or you fail.
Right, 1 or 0.
Yes. And the pursuit of a goal places you in a permanent state of pre-success failure until the moment you finally cross that finish line.
Wait, I want you to expand on that phrase. A permanent state of pre-success failure. That is really heavy.
It is heavy, but it's true. Think about it. If your goal is to lose 20 pounds, every single day that you step on the scale and you hasn't lost 20 pounds, you are technically failing to meet your goal.
Even if you're making progress.
Even if you lost half a pound. The gap between where you are and the goal still remains. You are still not at the goal. This creates a chronic, low-grade psychological stress. You are constantly carrying the weight of being not there yet.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
And worse, let's look at what happens when you actually succeed.
Right, because theoretically, that's the happy part.
Theoretically, you run the marathon, you cross the finish line, you get the shiny medal, the dopamine hits hard. But what happens the very next morning?
Oh, the void.
The void.
You wake up, and the organizing principle of the last 6 months of your life is just gone.
Yes. The goal was the scaffolding that was holding up all your daily behavior. Once the goal is achieved, the scaffolding is immediately removed. This is exactly why you see so many people train for a marathon, run it, and then literally not run another mile for 6 months.
Because the behavior was tied to the finite endpoint. It wasn't tied to the identity of just being a runner.
Exactly. Systems, conversely, are not about the finish line. Systems are entirely about the daily process. A system is an approach to problem solving that operates completely independent of a final objective.
Let's ground this a bit in Dr. Judd's clinical analysis from the sources, specifically his look at habit frameworks. If a goal is this singular focus that requires a high dopamine state, how does the system function differently on a neurological level?
Well, Dr. Judd points to James Clear's model of making behavior automatic. A system basically transfers the burden of execution away from your conscious willpower. It outsources that burden to your physical environment and your daily routines.
Give me a concrete example of that.
Okay, let's say you want to write a book. The goal-oriented approach is to wake up every morning, stare at a blank screen on your computer, try desperately to summon the muse, and rely on sheer discipline to force out 2,000 words.
Which sounds agonizing.
Because it is. That requires massive cognitive load. Your brain is burning so much energy just fighting the resistance to start.
So what's the systems-oriented approach?
The systems-oriented approach is to set up your desk the night before. You block the internet using an app like Freedom, and you commit to sitting in the chair for 20 minutes with a cup of coffee. And that's it, regardless of whether you write a single word.
So the system doesn't actually care about the word count.
Not at all.
The system only cares about the friction of sitting in the chair.
Exactly. And this is where the neuroscience becomes incredibly validating for anyone who has struggled with this. To really grasp this, we need to look closely at two very specific regions of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia.
Okay.
Because this is where the actual biological battle for your consistency is fought every single day.
Let's trace the mechanics of that battle. We touched on this earlier, but I really want to go much deeper for the listener. Let's talk about the prefrontal cortex first.
Right.
We always hear it described as like the executive center of the brain.
Yeah, that's the common term. It is the seat of conscious thought, Complex planning, impulse control, logical deduction, all of that lives there. When you are forcing yourself to do something difficult, like resisting a craving or analyzing a complex spreadsheet or trying to stay focused on writing a proposal, you are heavily utilizing the prefrontal cortex.
You're using your willpower.
Yes. But the crucial biological reality, the thing most people don't know, is that the prefrontal cortex is a massive, massive energy hog.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. It metabolizes glucose at an astonishing rate.
So it isn't just a metaphor when we say, oh man, my brain is tired today. There is a literal physical depletion of metabolic resources happening in our heads.
Completely literal. Think of the prefrontal cortex like rendering a massive 4K video file on an old laptop.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right. You click render, the fan spins up super loud, the processor gets incredibly hot, and the battery drains incredibly fast.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to take off.
You simply cannot render 4K video all day long without the system eventually just shutting down. And this limitation is exactly what the researchers at the University of Southern California mapped out in their study on decision fatigue.
The USC study is fascinating to me because it quantifies something we all intuitively feel but don't usually have a name for. They looked at how repeated acts of decision-making physically impair our ability to control our own behavior.
Yes.
Break down how they measured this and what they actually found, because I think this is huge for anyone who feels guilty about their evenings.
So decision fatigue occurs because the prefrontal cortex does not distinguish between a critical, life-altering decision and a trivial, mundane one.
Wait, really? It treats them the same?
Biologically, yes. Every choice you make draws from the exact same metabolic reservoir. Deciding which shirt to wear in the morning, what to eat for breakfast, how to carefully word a sensitive email to a frustrated colleague, navigating rush hour traffic, choosing which task to tackle first when you sit at your desk.
It's all rendering 4K video.
Exactly. Each of these micro decisions chips away at your prefrontal capacity. The battery drops by 1%, then another percent, then another.
Which totally explains why the most successful people, the stereotypical tech CEOs, often wear the exact same clothes every single day.
Yes, the Steve Jobs turtleneck.
Right. They are ruthlessly eliminating trivial decisions just to preserve that 4K rendering power for the decisions that actually matter to their company.
Precisely. And the USC research outlines very specific behavioral markers that occur when this depletion really hits. The first marker is a huge spike in impulsivity.
Impulsivity. Why does that happen?
As the prefrontal cortex loses energy, its ability to send inhibitory signals begins to fail.
Inhibitory signals, like the brakes.
Exactly like the brakes. The signals that tell you to stop, to wait, to reconsider, to not say the mean thing, those require energy. So this is why you are far, far more likely to snap at your partner at 7 p.m. than you are at 7 a.m.
Oh man, that hits home.
Right. It is not that you are angrier in the evening. It is simply that the biological mechanism required to suppress the anger is offline. The battery is dead.
And the second marker they noted in the study is decision avoidance. And honestly, I think this is the most insidious one of all.
Oh, it really is. Decision avoidance is basically a biological protective mechanism. When the battery is critically low, the brain just refuses to make any choice at all.
It just shuts down.
You stare at your inbox, you see 10 urgent emails, and you physically cannot bring yourself to open a single one. You just sit there paralyzed.
Yes. Or like you open a streaming service, right? Netflix or whatever, and you scroll through movies for 45 minutes without ever actually picking one.
The classic modern dilemma. Because the cognitive cost of selecting a movie, weighing the genres, deciding what you're in the mood for, it's too high. So your brain defaults to the passive, low-energy act of just scrolling.
Let's connect this back to our central thesis for the listener. When decision fatigue sets in and the prefrontal cortex essentially shuts down for the day, what happens to our motivation?
It ceases to exist as an actionable force.
It's just gone.
It's gone. You might still have the abstract desire to write your book, or to hit the gym, or to practice that language, but the actual hardware required to bridge the gap between that desire and the physical action is entirely out of fuel.
So what does the brain do? It has to keep functioning.
This is the critical moment. The brain shifts operations to a completely different region to save energy. It shifts control to the basal ganglia.
The basal ganglia. Okay, if the prefrontal cortex is the battery-draining 4K rendering engine, what is the basal ganglia?
Think of the basal ganglia as the background operating system. It is an older, much deeper structure in the brain. And its primary job is pattern recognition and automatic routines. And the beauty of it is that it requires almost zero metabolic energy to function.
So it's incredibly efficient.
Incredibly. When a behavior is repeated enough times, the prefrontal cortex literally physically hands the sequence over to the basal ganglia
How does it do that?
through a process called synaptic pruning and myelination. Basically, the neural pathways become insulated, like a wire, and they become incredibly fast and efficient.
Okay, so this is the actual biological mechanism of a habit. Like when you drive home from work and you suddenly pull into your driveway and you don't actually remember the commute at all.
Exactly. That is the basal ganglia taking over. It's driving the car while your conscious mind is elsewhere. The basal ganglia does not think. It does not plan for the future. It simply recognizes a cue in the environment, executes the pre-programmed routine, and waits for the dopamine reward.
And here is the terrifying part for anyone relying on motivation. When your prefrontal cortex is depleted by decision fatigue at the end of the day, the basal ganglia takes the wheel entirely.
Yes.
And the basal ganglia will always default to the most deeply ingrained, lowest friction pathway available in that moment.
Always. It is a biological certainty. If your environment is filled with high-friction tasks, like a complex workout routine where you have to find your gear and drive 20 minutes, and it's also filled with low-friction escapes like social media on your phone or junk food in the pantry, the basal ganglia will choose the escape every single time.
Because it's easier.
Because it costs less energy. It doesn't care about your long-term goals. It doesn't care about your health. It only cares about immediate, low-energy rewards.
Let's look at a really concrete example of this exact neurological battle, because the story of Ben Meir in our sources perfectly illustrates what happens when someone tries to just out-motivate a hostile environment.
Yeah, Ben's story is really a masterclass in the limits of willpower. So, before he developed the environment design systems we are looking at today, he was living in New York City.
Right.
And he had very clear intrinsic motivation. He wanted to write, he wanted to build this platform for personal growth, and he had that initial spark of inspiration we talked about.
But I want to play devil's advocate here and push back on the idea of his environment being the core problem, because New York City is full of incredibly successful writers and entrepreneurs. Why couldn't he just sit in his apartment and write? Why do we blame the city? Isn't that just an excuse?
Well, it is not about the geographic location itself. It's about the specific neural associations his unique brain had mapped to that specific environment.
I got back that.
His sensory environment, the specific sights of his neighborhood, the sounds out his window, the specific social circles he was embedded in, all of that acted as a constant barrage of cues. And those cues were hardwired via his basal ganglia to an old routine.
A routine of going out, socializing heavily, and partying.
Exactly. And the reward for that routine was the immediate dopamine hit of social validation.
So every single night, he was engaging in this massive biological conflict between his prefrontal cortex and his basal ganglia.
Exactly. It was a war. His prefrontal cortex wanted him to stay in his apartment and write. But to do that, he had to actively suppress the deeply ingrained routines triggered by his environment. He had to use conscious willpower to ignore the texts from his friends, ignore the noise outside, deny the easy social reward.
Rendering that 4K video.
Rendering it constantly just to stay seated. And because willpower is a finite metabolic resource, he would inevitably succumb to decision fatigue. He writes very candidly in his guide that if he had stayed in that environment, relying purely on force to resist it, he would never have written his guide.
Wow.
He would have just continued nursing a hangover, completely trapped in a loop that he desperately, consciously wanted to escape.
So the solution wasn't to just dig deeper. It wasn't to watch another motivational video or find more discipline. The solution was to physically sever the connection between the cue and the routine.
He had to change his physical location. He had to create a blank slate for his nervous system. By leaving that specific environment, he removed the cues entirely. He stopped draining his prefrontal cortex, just trying to resist his surroundings.
And that freed up the metabolic energy he actually needed to sit down and write.
Precisely.
This brings us to, I think, the most practical part of our discussion today. If we accept that motivation is this fleeting chemical state, right, and that our environment will always eventually overpower our willpower, how do we actually engineer a shift? How do we build systems that automate progress for us?
The shift begins the moment we stop trying to maximize our output and start trying to minimize our friction.
Minimize friction.
Yes. Our goal is to design a life where doing the right thing requires the absolute minimum amount of prefrontal cortex engagement possible. We can look at the Agile results methodology from our stack for the underlying philosophy here.
Yeah, Agile Results advocates a principle that really resonated with me when I was prepping for this. They say, quote, spend your best energy on your best work.
It's brilliant.
It sounds so simple,
Yeah.
but it fundamentally rejects this whole modern hustle culture idea that you should be operating at maximum intensity, grinding all day long.
Because hustle culture entirely ignores human biology. Agile results acknowledges that your energy naturally fluctuates. You have peaks and valleys. A robust system must flex with your biological reality. It doesn't demand perfection. It demands consistency within realistic parameters.
It's forgiving.
It is. And what is really fascinating is how this concept of friction reduction is evolving with modern technology. We are analyzing data from 2026, and the integration of AI into our personal systems has fundamentally altered the entire landscape of decision fatigue.
I want to explore this deeply because I know the idea of AI managing our lives can feel a bit dystopian to some people.
Understandably so.
Like if an AI is categorizing our tasks, drafting our responses, telling us what to do next, do we lose our edge? Do we become these sort of passive passengers in our own lives?
The data suggests the exact opposite, actually. When you look at the cognitive load of modern knowledge work, a massive, massive percentage of our prefrontal cortex capacity is entirely wasted on what the sources call the admin layer of life.
The admin layer, like what?
It is the friction of categorization. Think about it. When you open your computer in the morning and you have to spend 45 minutes just organizing your inbox, prioritizing your task list across 3 different apps, scheduling meetings, figuring out what's urgent versus what's important, you are draining your battery before you have done a single piece of meaningful work.
Right. You're rendering the 4K video of administrative triage.
Exactly. And by the time you actually start the real work, you're exhausted. The AI agents described in the 2026 sources act as an external prefrontal cortex for routine tasks.
An external prefrontal cortex. That is a wild concept.
But that's what it is. The system digests the chaos overnight, and it presents you with a curated, friction-free starting point in the morning. The AI surfaces the 3 most critical tasks based on context and deadlines. You wake up, and instead of facing a wall of stressful decisions,
The system simply hands you the next logical step.
exactly. You haven't lost your edge. You have preserved your peak cognitive energy for deep, creative problem solving. You have entirely eliminated the decision avoidance we talked about earlier.
That makes total sense. It is about clearing the path so the basal ganglia can just walk forward without needing the conscious brain to navigate every single pebble.
Yes.
But what about the habits themselves? Because AI can't go to the gym for us. How do we systemize a new behavior when we don't have an AI to just do it for us? Dr. Judd highlights B.J. Fogg's research here, which I think is incredibly powerful for this.
B.J. Fogg's tiny habits model is truly the ultimate expression of friction reduction. Fogg argues that if you want a behavior to become automatic, you must scale it down to an impossibly small action.
Possibly small.
Yes, and the neurobiology supports this entirely. If the action is small enough, it literally falls below the threshold of requiring significant prefrontal cortex activation.
Okay, give me an example of how small we are talking about here. Because when most people try to scale down, they say, okay, instead of a 1-hour workout, I'll compromise and do a 20-minute workout.
Right. But that is still way too big.
Really? 20 minutes is too big.
Biologically, yes, for a new habit. Because a 20-minute workout still requires deciding what exercises to do, changing your clothes, dealing with sweat, and managing physical discomfort.
Yeah.
All of that still requires willpower.
Okay, so what is impossibly small?
Impossibly small means doing one single push-up. One, or, to use our earlier example, merely putting your running shoes on. You don't even have to run. The system is entirely fulfilled the moment the shoes are tied.
But I have to be honest, and I'm sure the listener is thinking this too. How does just putting on shoes actually lead to running a marathon? It feels ridiculous. It feels like we're lying to ourselves.
It feels ridiculous because we are totally obsessed with the volume of the outcome rather than the neural pathway of the habit.
Ooh, say that again?
We care about the volume, not the pathway. But remember, the basal ganglia learns through repetition and routine. By making the action impossibly small, like just putting on the shoes, you guarantee success every single day, regardless of your motivation levels. You are physically paving the neural pathway.
You're laying the track.
Exactly. Once the pathway is insulated and automatic, scaling up the volume is easy. Once the shoes are on and it feels weird not to put them on, taking a step outside is easy. But you cannot scale a habit that doesn't exist yet. You must establish the low-friction system first.
Wow. Let's bring this macro philosophy directly into the physical space of the listener. Let's talk about environment design, relying really heavily on Ben Mears' framework here.
This is where it gets really actionable.
If our environment is basically a collection of invisible cues triggering our basal ganglia, how do we hack those cues?
Well, Mears' framework starts with the exact concept we opened the show with, the broken windows theory.
The Zimbardo experiment.
Yes. Zimbardo's experiment wasn't just about cars and crime. It was fundamentally about how the human brain processes visual disorder.
Mears applies this directly to our homes and our offices, right? He talks about the danger of a single unwashed dish in the sink. And I want to trace the psychological cascade of that dish, because it sounds dramatic. How does one dish ruin my productivity?
Because the brain does not process that dish merely as a piece of dirty ceramic, it processes it as a failure of a system.
A failure.
It is a visual cue of delayed maintenance. When your visual cortex registers the dirty dish, it subtly communicates to the rest of your brain that standards in this environment are relaxed. It is the broken window.
Wow.
And just like the residents in Palo Alto, your basal ganglia reacts to that relaxed standard. It says, oh, if the dish can stay in the sink, then maybe the mail can stay piled on the dining table.
And if the mail can pile up, maybe I don't need to fold the laundry on the chair.
Exactly. The chaos compounds.
It compounds rapidly, and it creates this background hum of cognitive stress. Every single time you walk past the messy kitchen, your prefrontal cortex has to actively suppress the thought, ooh, I really need to clean that.
Yes, it is a microdrain on your battery every time you see it. Mears' system fix is absolute. Ruthlessly eliminate visual disorder. Make the bed the absolute moment you stand up. Clear the desk completely at the end of the day. You are not doing this to be neat or aesthetic. You are doing this to literally protect your metabolic energy from the subtle drain of environmental chaos.
Which leads perfectly into his second principle, which he calls sensory optimization. This is where we look at the sheer biological dominance of human vision.
The statistics on this are staggering. The human nervous system has roughly 11 million sensory receptors taking in information from the outside world at any given time.
11 million.
11 million. And nearly 10 million of those receptors are dedicated entirely to sight.
10 out of 11 million.
Roughly half of the brain's entire internal processing power is devoted just to making sense of what we see.
Which means we are incredibly, uniquely vulnerable to visual cues.
We are primarily visual creatures. So environment design must prioritize visual optimization. The system here is very simple. Make the cues for the habits you want glaringly obvious, and make the cues for the habits you want to avoid completely invisible.
James Clear talks about this a lot, how environment is less about the physical objects in a room and more about your relationship to them.
Exactly.
Explain that distinction for the listener. What does a relationship to an object mean in this context?
Think about your couch, right in your living room. If you have spent the last 3 years sitting on that couch, eating snacks and watching television after work, your basal ganglia has mapped an incredibly strong, thick neural relationship between the visual cue of the couch and the routine of passive consumption.
It's hardwired.
Very hardwired. So if you decide you want to start reading profound literature and you sit on that exact same couch with a book, you are fighting a massive uphill battle. The couch is actively screaming at your brain to turn on the TV.
So you have to create a new relationship in a totally new space.
Yes.
You put a dedicated reading chair in the corner of the bedroom, you put a nice lamp next to it, and you place the book visibly on the armrest. You establish a new, uncorrupted neural pathway tied to a specific new visual cue.
Exactly. And you must simultaneously hide the negative cues. Put the TV remote in a drawer in another room. Put it out of sight. The moment you remove the visual cue, you drastically lower the activation energy required to resist the bad habit. Out of sight literally means out of the basal ganglia's processing loop.
This brings up Mears' third principle, minimalism and the active pursuit of less. And he uses an example that I think is universally understood. He talks about a Reese's peanut butter cup sitting in his refrigerator.
The classic test of willpower.
Right. And I want to debate this because we like to think we are rational, capable adults. Why can't an adult simply look at a piece of candy and choose not to eat it? Is our willpower really that fragile?
Well, it is not about fragility. It is about the mathematics of willpower depletion over time. Let's trace the actual biological event of that Reese's cup.
Okay, let's do it.
You wake up, and you open the fridge at 8 a.m. to get milk for your coffee. Your visual cortex processes the Reese's cups sitting there. It immediately triggers a dopamine prediction response in the midbrain, anticipating the sugar.
But you don't eat it at 8 a.m.
Right, because your prefrontal cortex immediately fires an inhibitory signal. No, we're eating healthy today, it's morning.
And the signal works. You close the fridge. You win.
It works at 8 a.m., yes, because you just woke up and your battery is 100% full. But that inhibitory signal required glucose to generate. You've just spent a tiny fraction of your willpower for the day.
Okay.
Now, you open the fridge at noon to get lunch. The exact same cycle happens. You see it, the dopamine hits, you suppress it. Another fraction of willpower is spent. Now, fast forward. By 9 p.m., after a long day of making decisions at work, navigating traffic, managing your kids, dealing with stress, your prefrontal cortex is metabolically exhausted.
The decision fatigue has peaked.
Yes. The battery is at 1%. You open the fridge just to get a glass of water. The visual cue triggers the dopamine response. But this time, the prefrontal cortex cannot mount a strong enough inhibitory signal to suppress the urge.
You can't stop it.
It physically can't. The basal ganglia takes over, seeking the immediate, low-effort reward. You eat the peanut butter cup.
So the system failure wasn't eating the candy at 9 p.m. The system failure was allowing the candy to enter the house in the first place.
Exactly. The system fix is recognizing that you cannot win a war of attrition against your own visual cortex. It's impossible. So you outsource the discipline to the grocery store.
You make the hard decision once.
Yes. When your battery is full at the store, you choose not to buy it. You remove the object from your physical environment entirely, so your brain never has to waste precious energy resisting it later.
That makes total sense. Let's pivot to our digital environments, though. Because while a Reese's cup is a passive threat sitting in a fridge, our phones are active predators.
They really are.
They are essentially slot machines in our pockets, perfectly engineered by behavioral psychologists to hijack the basal ganglia and keep the dopamine loop running constantly. How do we design a system to defend against a device like that? We have to combine the insights from the Freedom app, Ben Meir, and the USC research here. The fundamental rule of digital environment design is using technology to block technology.
Fighting fire with fire.
Exactly. You cannot rely on an exhausted prefrontal cortex to resist the infinite novelty of a smartphone algorithm. It is a completely unfair fight.
So you use a system like the Freedom app to physically sever the connection.
Yes. If you know that your willpower reliably crashes between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. and you usually lose those 2 hours to just mindless scrolling, you do not try to build more discipline.
You don't try to be stronger.
No. You set the app to automatically block all social media and distracting websites during that exact window. You create an artificial barrier. When your basal ganglia automatically prompts you to open the app, you tap it, but the screen is blocked.
The routine is broken. The routine is broken. And the friction of trying to bypass the blocker, going into settings, turning it off, is usually enough friction to wake up your conscious mind and redirect your attention.
You are making the bad behavior mechanically impossible during your weakest moments. I love that.
Yeah.
But what about professional digital environments? Ben Meir suggests a specific protocol for email that attempts to solve the constant micro-distractions of knowledge work.
Yes, he advocates for the 3-2-1-0 email system because most people leave their inbox open on a secondary monitor all day long, right?
Guilty. Everyone does that.
But every single time a notification pings, the brain experiences a massive context switch. Your focus is shattered and you have to expend huge metabolic energy to refocus on your original task. Over an 8-hour day, those hundreds of micro-interruptions create severe decision fatigue.
So the 321-ishism is about batching, right? Explain how that works.
Yes. The system is that you check your email exactly 3 times a day. You spend precisely 21 minutes per session, and your goal is to process the inbox to zero categorizing, deleting, or responding quickly.
Now, I want to push back on the rigidity of that, because 21 minutes seems entirely arbitrary, and for many jobs, checking email only 3 times a day would literally get you fired. Does a system have to be this rigid to work?
That's a fair point, but the exact number of minutes isn't really the point. The psychology of the constraint is what matters.
The constraint.
Yeah. Parkinson's law states that work expands to fill the time allotted for its completion. If you give yourself an open-ended hour to check email, you will spend an hour agonizing over responses. By compressing the time limit to 20 minutes, you force your brain to make rapid, decisive choices. You reduce the cognitive drag of perfectionism.
And if 3 times a day isn't viable?
Then adapt it. The underlying principle still applies. Turn off notifications and batch the processing into dedicated finite windows instead of a continuous exhausting drip all day long.
Okay, so we have talked about physical environments and digital environments. Well, let's look at the broader physiological routines that our sources highlight, specifically from the USC research, because they point to routines as the ultimate antidote to decision fatigue.
Yes, because a routine is simply a systemized sequence of decisions made in advance.
Made in advance.
The classic example they use is meal prepping on Sundays. Let's look at the actual cognitive load of daily food choices. If you do not have a system, every single evening at 6 p.m. when your blood sugar is low and your brain is tired, you have to ask, what is for dinner?
The worst question of the day.
It is. You have to negotiate with your partner, you look in the fridge, you realize you are missing an ingredient, and then you have to weigh the massive effort of cooking against the ease of just ordering a pizza.
The friction is massive, and the pizza is a very low-friction dopamine reward.
Exactly. But by Sunday afternoon, your willpower is relatively high. You design the menu, you buy the groceries, and you prep the ingredients, you front-load the cognitive effort.
So on Wednesday at 6 p.m., there is literally no decision to make.
None. The system dictates the action. You simply open the fridge, take out the container, and heat it up. You have bypassed the prefrontal cortex entirely.
And finally, we have to talk about the most foundational biological system of all, sleep. We treat sleep like a luxury, right? Like it's something to sacrifice for productivity. But the USC data frames it as a hard biological constraint on our ability to execute literally any of these systems.
Sleep is the non-negotiable physical reset button for the brain. It's not a luxury, it's a structural requirement. When we are awake, the metabolic processes in our neurons produce a byproduct called adenosine.
Adenosine?
Yes. As adenosine builds up throughout the day, it binds to receptors and physically slows down brain activity, causing the feeling of sleepiness. It heavily impairs the prefrontal cortex.
So sleep isn't just resting. It is a physical clearing mechanism for that buildup.
Exactly. Specifically, during slow-wave deep sleep, the brain's glymphatic system activates. It literally flushes the cerebral spinal fluid through the brain tissue, clearing out the adenosine and other metabolic waste products.
It washes the brain.
It washes it. If you do not get 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep, that flushing process is incomplete. You wake up with residual adenosine still blocking your neural receptors. Your prefrontal cortex begins the day already operating at a deficit.
Which means no amount of motivation, no perfectly designed room, and no AI agent can save you if the physical hardware is compromised from the minute you wake up.
Without sleep, you are demanding structural changes from an organ that simply does not have the biological capacity to perform them. Protecting your sleep with a rigid wind-down system is really the ultimate act of environment design.
You know, as we connect all these disparate sources today, like the neurobiology of the basal ganglia, the history of the broken windows theory, the digital blockers, the chemistry of sleep, a very clear, empathetic picture emerges.
It really does.
It feels less like we are hacking our lives for productivity and more like we are finally learning how to parent our own biology with compassion.
That's a beautiful way to say it.
We are setting up our environment so that our future self, the tired, stressed out, completely unmotivated version of us can still succeed without having to suffer so much.
That is the profound shift. Relying on motivation is almost an act of cruelty toward yourself because it demands that you fight your own evolutionary programming every single day.
It's just beating yourself up.
Building a system, on the other hand, is an act of grace. You are acknowledging your human limits. You are building guardrails so that when you inevitably stumble, because you will, the environment catches you and gently guides you back to the path.
Bringing this all together, I really want to return to the core emotional truth for the listener, because we have unpacked a tremendous amount of science, but ultimately this lands in a very personal, very emotional place.
Yes. Let's speak directly to the reality of the listener, grounding this in the deepest insights we have extracted from Dr. Judd and the neuroscientific research. Breaking a bad habit or building a new one is not a test of your moral character.
It's really not.
It is a physical neurological challenge. It requires neuroplasticity. You are asking your brain to physically dismantle existing neural pathways and build entirely new ones.
It is literal microscopic construction work happening inside your skull.
Yes. So if you are listening to this and you have spent years starting projects with excitement only to watch them slowly collapse as your energy wanes.
If you have stared at a whiteboard full of goals and just felt this crushing sense of inadequacy.
I want you to understand the biology of what actually happened. You are not lazy.
No.
You never were. The frustration, the deep self-blame, the feeling of inconsistency you have carried around for years, all of it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of your own machinery.
You have been applying the wrong tool to a structural problem.
You have been trying to use the fragile, fleeting emotion of motivation to do the heavy lifting of structural brain change.
You were trying to paddle upstream with your bare hands, completely ignoring the fact that everyone else had a motor.
And your brain was simply doing exactly what it was evolutionarily designed to do. Conserve energy by relying on the oldest, easiest pathways available in a chaotic environment.
Wow.
By shifting your focus away from chasing motivation and toward designing systems, you are finally working with your biology instead of fighting a losing war against it. You do not lack discipline. You just haven't had the right system yet.
That reframing changes absolutely everything. It just takes that heavy weight of moral failure right off your shoulders.
Yeah.
As we close this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought.
Yeah.
It is a concept to just quietly ponder as you go about the rest of your day. Drawn from Ben Mears' guide. He quoted the model and actress Amber Valletta, who made this deceptively simple observation. She said, "We are what we see. We are products of our surroundings."
It is a profound summation of all the neurobiology we have discussed today. The visual cues dictate the basal ganglia, which dictates the life.
It really is. So here's my question for you. Do an audit right now. Look up.
Just look around.
Look around the room you are in, the office where you are sitting, or the layout of the apps on the home screen of your phone right now. Look at the physical objects occupying your immediate space. What is the invisible hand of your current environment gently, quietly pushing you to do today?
And is it what you actually want?
Because that awareness is the first required step. Once you see the broken glass, you can finally start sweeping it up.
It all begins with just noticing the friction.
It does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, the first small step toward a new system doesn't require a massive burst of dopamine or motivation. It just requires a little bit of curiosity about how to make tomorrow slightly easier than today. Be kind to yourself, give your prefrontal cortex a break, and we will see you next time.